Okay, excellent. I'll kick off. So welcome everyone to this IES Land Condition Early Career Network event, Sustainable Management Practices and Materials Management. This event is being held in collaboration with the Ireland Brownfield Network and REMSOC. So thank you to both of those organisations for helping organise. Before we get started, I just wanted to give you a bit of context. So the IES Land Condition Early Career Network provides tailored CPD opportunities for land condition professionals at the start of their career. The network provides a forum for exploring topical issues in the sector, connecting with fellow professionals and developing skills and knowledge. We aim to collaborate where possible to increase the networking opportunities. And this event has been set up as a meeting, as we are keen for these to be as interactive as possible in the virtual environment. Today we're going to have 3 presentations. I'll just go to our agenda, which you can see is quite packed. So we're going to have 3 presentations. The first will be about sustainable management practices, the second about sustainable management of excavated soils, and then one on professional development as well. Some of these will be recorded and distributed afterwards, and you'll get these in an email. There will also be time for questions and discussions. We really appreciate it if you be active in these discussions. We're really keen to hear from you as early career professionals. So for those Q&As and the discussions, please do feel free to turn on your camera and unmute yourselves. During the presentations, however, it'd be really useful if just for the recording, if you can make sure that you're muted so that it doesn't interrupt with the sound for anyone else. Great. So that's the main things. Just a bit of housekeeping as well, as I just mentioned. Please do feel free to introduce yourself using the chat function.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
There'll be plenty of opportunities for questions, and you can do these in 2 ways. You can either raise your hand during the Q&A time, or you can just pop them in the chat and they'll be read out on your behalf. Just stop sharing and introduce our first speaker. So to kick off, I'm delighted to introduce Nicola Harries, who will be talking about sustainable management practices, what they are and how to use them. Nicola is a chartered geologist and chartered scientist and has over 30 years experience within the environmental industry. She's a technical director at Clare and has responsibility for managing a number of projects and initiatives. For example, she coordinates the National Brownfield Forum, the National Quality Mark Scheme for Land Contamination Management Steering Group, and the Sustainable Remediation Forum in the UK and internationally. Thank you so much, Nicola, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you see the screen?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Excellent. A thunderstorm has just started in Guildford, so apologies if you hear big bangs and crashes. So thank you very much, Ethny. I'm from Clare, as I was introduced, and I'm going to talk to you about a publication that was issued in the autumn of last year. So we've been doing a road trip trying to promote this document, and it's got a very useful spreadsheet, and hopefully at the end of this presentation you will go out and seek and have a play with it. So just a very quick introduction about Clare for those of you who aren't familiar. Hopefully you are, but we've been in existence since 1999 now. We're a UK charity, not-for-profit organisation, and we work in the land contamination brownfield sector, very much focused on the sustainable land reuse. So lots of different initiatives and projects around those areas. We've got a huge free library of publications that are accessible for you to review and access and read at your leisure. And as Ethny says, I also coordinate the Surf UK steering group, and this is actually a project within Clare which we coordinate, and it has its own dedicated steering group. And there is an international forum of surfs, and they are from around the world. So we have representations from Taiwan, Australia, North and South America, and across Europe, and Africa as well now. So it's great. We coordinate our work and we share our knowledge. Sorry, the heavens have just opened. So Surf UK, as a project within Clare, was established in 2007, and it's been developed. We've developed a framework which was published back in 2010, and that was the first framework for considering sustainability within soil and groundwater remediation. And it was the first across the world. And it's great because other countries and jurisdictions have used that as their framework. They copied it and just put a front cover on it. That framework has also helped develop the ISO standard which was published in 2017. And the ISO standard follows exactly the same process. So there's no divergence from the Surf UK framework and the ISO standard. But the good thing about an ISO standard is countries that don't have a strong regulator, or they don't have the understanding so much of sustainable remediation, it allows those countries to signpost to an international standard. So it's lovely that they are aligned. The other really important thing about Surf UK is we're considering sustainability in its whole holistic side of things. So it's not just focusing on remediation. Even though the name is called Sustainable Remediation Forum, we are talking about remediation when you're considering at the high level of planning, when you're actually designing your site remediation, and then the actual selection of the remediation technology. So it is really important to think when you are considering remediation, you're considering it on the whole site side of things. So this is what we're meaning about a holistic sustainability assessment. And the goal of Surf UK is fundamentally to produce usable outputs that have widespread regulatory support, are practical, effective, and meet business needs and are globally relevant. So sorry about the blurred, I was trying to cut and paste this. If you are wanting to find out where all the information about Surf UK, it's on this part of the Clare website. So it's under projects and initiatives. You hover over that and all the different projects that we run, and there's Surf UK. The other thing I wanted to focus on, the key resources that we have that I would actively encourage you to look at. Now this presentation is going to be available at the end, so there's other things that I'd like you to go and have a look at, but I'm going to be focusing on the sustainable management practices that were published last year. But I will be referring to what we call SR1 and SR2, which is the supplementary reports. And this is the selection criteria for carrying out a sustainability assessment. So this is where we refer to a lot of the indicators when people say, well, what are you actually measuring against? All the indicators are published in this SR2 report. As I alluded to, there's a framework and there's a really good introductory animation as well. The Tier 1 assessment tool is built to allow you to carry out a simple sustainability assessment. And again, it ties up to the SR1 and SR2 report. But I'm focusing on the sustainable management practices. So what is an SMP? An SMP is a simple common sense action. So these are really things that you would hopefully be doing automatically on site, or when you're preparing to go out on site, or when you're planning to carry out some work on site, but actually you're recording them against sustainability principles and practices. So the SMPs can actually improve the benefits of a project. They could also reduce the negative impacts of a project because you're actually mapping them against sustainability activities. So when I talked about SR1 and SR2, these are the indicators. The indicators are split in between environmental, social, and economic. It's the same number of indicators, 5 within each. So it means it's very balanced. And that's the whole principle of sustainability. It's a balance between environmental, social, and economic. So environmental 1, it's got a title of air. So what we're talking about is potential benefits. When we're talking about the indicators, how to reduce emissions to air. So environmental 2 is the impacts on soil and ground conditions. And this is minimizing emissions to soil and improving soil functions. You'll see these are sort of just example benefits. I'm not going to go through all of them because I haven't got time, but it's really important to show that all of these indicators have got activities against each one of them. So I would actively encourage you to look at SR2 report. So an SMP, it's an action that can be applied to different stages of a project, as well as a different project type. When we talk about different stages, as I mentioned, sustainability, SURF UK looks at things in a holistic way. So it's talking about when you're actually planning. So it could be at the planning stage, or it could actually be at the construction stage. Or when you're talking about different types of projects, you could be carrying out a site investigation, you could be carrying out a desk study, you could be carrying out a remediation. So SMPs have been mapped against different stages as well as different types of projects. And this is just another example of how you can show how SMPs, you're implementing SMPs across all the different activities of a construction project. And the really important thing about SMPs is you can have them at very high level. It could be at corporate level. So for example, you may have a client who says, I am setting sustainability criteria for all my supply chain. And this could be carbon counting. It could be identifying economic benefits for the local community, different levels for corporate. So you could be mapping your sustainability practices against corporate level that have been set for you as a company, or you work for a corporate company and you are setting those for your supply chain. Or you could do your sustainable management practices on a number of sites, a portfolio of sites, so you can map them against all your sites. Or it could be on an individual project. So what I'm just trying to say is sustainable management practices can be used at all sorts of different levels, whether they're individual projects or whether they are corporate company level. So the heavens have absolutely opened here. So just to give you some examples, I'm having to raise my voice because it's teaming it. Just to give you some examples, just to put it into context. So a sustainable management practice might be minimizing vehicle movements. Now you think, oh, that's really sensible because that cuts down carbon and things, but it's actually mapping these against the indicators. So the impact, environmental 1, is air. So that means you're reducing the impact on air. Environmental 5 is natural resources and waste. So you're reducing the use of natural resources. Again, for society 1 is about human health and safety. So less miles you do, less chance of accidents for your local community or for your staff, and the impact on the social for your neighborhood as well. So what we're trying to say is each simple process or practice you can map against your sustainability criteria. Give you some other quick examples. A sustainable management practice titled ensure proper maintenance of vehicles, plant and equipment, i.e. you maintain your tire pressures, correct loading of vehicles. This means you can map it against environmental 1, social 5. You're not quantifying things, you're just identifying the different sustainability criteria that would improve if you carried out this action and you mapped it against that action. Again, if you don't, you make it a company policy to not allow plant and equipment to run for no purpose. Again, it has benefits on environmental 1, 5, social 1, social 3, economic 1. Again, if your project requires reforestation, and this would then have these benefits against the different indicators. Again, if you used alternative energy sources, you started having photovoltaic systems if you were doing a remediation project, or you looked at ground horse seats, ground heat pumps, or used a wind turbine for a long-term remediation project. So these are the indicators you could benefit from. Again, if you use GPS equipment on your site, that would cut down the amount of material you had to do, cut and fill, for example, if you were on a big construction site. These are the different indicators that we've mapped against that activity. Again, if you used a mobile laboratory or field testing techniques, so you reduced off-site taking samples off into a laboratory, again, that would improve these indicators. So just to give you some, they are simple processes that you would do, but you're actually mapping them against sustainable management practices. So what you're doing is the sustainable management practice. What we've done is we've actually mapped them against LCRM, the land condition risk management process. So we've got the stages of procurement and land use planning. And then under the LCRM, we've identified processes under risk assessment, options appraisal, remediation and verification. And so this helps you again. So it cuts out the thought process for you. You can actually search the process, the spreadsheet. So just going through the process very quickly. Initially, you identify your activity. What are you actually going to be planning to do or carry out on a site or as part of your project? Again, as I had identified, these are the different stages we've identified. Then you would look to identify your sustainability objectives. What are the objectives that are associated with the project? So depending on the activity, you would then develop a short list of what would be important to the project. As I mentioned, you may have a client that is setting targets for CO2 emissions or reducing the use of natural resources or waste minimization. Some clients have health and safety criteria that you must meet. The sustainability objectives must be associated with regulatory compliance, and you can address your stakeholder concerns as well. So it's identifying those key objectives. So the next stage is how can those sustainability gains be achieved? And this is where we use the spreadsheet as a checklist. And I will show you that in a minute. So the important thing is when you actually look to use an SMP, there needs to be a good reason for doing it. Don't just say, oh yeah, we could do that. You actually have a good reason for doing it. And the SMP should be relevant to the project, quick to implement. We're not trying to create extra work here. It needs to give you gains that are cost effective. And the SMPs are not necessarily new things to do, as I mentioned at the beginning. It's just for you to actually start recording activities that you would do. And then you can start recording that against a number of different projects, and you can see the real sustainability gains across your business. So the actions then are documented, and you may be needing to identify these actions and educate some staff and say, this is what we're going to do because of X. So you may be developing an internal policy. You may develop some standing operating procedures to adapt your activity just so you start recording things. You could be changing your procurement process to start recording things. If you're a client, again, you may identify your goods and services from consultants and contractors, and you want to actually start building that in. Again, your subcontractors. You then develop some internal training, and then you start incorporating your SMPs into your project design and methodology, and you start recording these and measuring them and reporting them. Once you have done all of that, then you can carry out a post-project performance review and see whether things worked or didn't, or how you could adapt your processes and procedures to get better processes and get some better operating procedures at the end of it. And ultimately, you will probably identify that you actually made some cost savings, and you can see whether it's worth it or not. So I've gone through, that's the process. So this is the process that you would go through using the spreadsheet that I will just quickly demonstrate. So the spreadsheet is it's just a template, it's an Excel template for you to use. So it allows you to identify, record and evaluate sustainable management practices, whether it's a project or a portfolio of projects. We've gone through and identified 182 SMPs for you to choose from. Now you can use some of them, you could use half of them, you could use 10 of them, whichever ones that you think are applicable to your project, and you can add to them as well. It's an Excel spreadsheet, it's open, so you can change it, adapt it, refine it to whatever is suitable for you. And obviously it's free to download. So it's been created. So you've got the SMPs on the left-hand side, then you've got the project activities in the middle, and then you've got the sustainability indicators. So the project activities, as I mentioned, we've identified sustainable management practices that link to procurement, land use planning, risk assessment, site investigation, options appraisal, remediation strategy. You can search through this so you can see which ones are more applicable to whichever activity, whichever sustainable management practice, and then which indicators meet those. So for example, you could have implement measures to prevent fly tipping and to remove fly tipped waste. So you can see how that would have an economic benefit, 1, 2, an environmental improvement on environmental 2, and it goes on along. You could have implementing, ensuring that all necessary permits, consents and exemptions are in place for abstraction licenses, discharge consents. You've gone through, so we've gone through all these different thought processes, avoid mixing soils, etc. You can filter, you can sort, you can select. So it's very, very flexible. And then the spreadsheet at the end, what I mentioned at the end is then you can also, why you've chosen those ones, you can make a comment of what's your justification, and then you can say whether you've implemented it, yes or no, and then you can carry out a performance review after your project. So you, for example, avoid mixing soils and waste. What is the benefit of that? What's the justification? Did you do it? Yes. And what was the outcome? What was the evidence? And the point is you're actually evidencing your activities, and that's your sustainability gains. So there are 2 case studies as well at the back of the report. National Grid use the SMPs. They've adapted it for their own business, and so have Shell. Here's the report that you can download, and here's the spreadsheet, as well as there's some posters which are some sustainable management practices for people can display around their offices if they want. So thank you very much. Any questions? I'm happy to answer them for you.
Many thanks, Nicola, for that presentation. That was really interesting. I think it's particularly important what you mentioned about evaluating at the end how you've achieved these sustainability gains and its usefulness in reporting, because it's often a really important now for projects to talk about their sustainability. So thank you for that. Do we have any questions for Nicola? If so, please raise your hand using the raise your hand function, or you can pop them in the chat. Might be that you were too comprehensive there, Nicola. Out of interest, when you were, what was the process for developing the spreadsheet? Was there a working group established? Or? Yeah,
it's part of the Surf UK steering group. It was initially published in 2014 or 2015, around about then. But we felt it needed to be updated, and the spreadsheet needed to be much more user-friendly, much more searchable, and map against different activities to help people think, okay, I'm carrying out a site investigation. What sustainability practices could actually fit under site investigation, because a lot of people think sustainability doesn't actually, it's not an easy thing to map. And what we're trying to say is these are really simple processes that you would actually do, but you'd never think there could be a sustainability gain for doing that activity. And often if you've got companies have these targets, often the sustainability or carbon targets, often carbon's an easy one to measure, but they have sustainability targets and companies say, oh, well, we're really a really sustainable company. But when you come down to all the different departments within a company, people think, well, I don't know how I help meet a company's objectives here. So this is a way that you can actually feel part of.
Next week, look at my calendar as well.
Got a mute. So it helps people actually fit into their whole company targets as well. So it's very simple processes.
Definitely. And in terms of the kind of the measurement side of things, when you're evaluating your progress, is there any kind of guidance on how different indicators can be measured, or is that more left open to the people running the project?
Yes, it's just what we're saying is they're not fixed targets. So if, for example, reducing vehicle movements would be one against the different indicators. And you could say, right, we're going to, on our sites, we're going to look to stop vehicles idling when they're just standing around. So you could say, okay, on this site, we haven't done that, but on this site, we've said, right, okay, we're going to make a really conscious effort. And that would be something very easy to quantify. And then you can say, well, we've met these sustainability targets here, because we can demonstrate this, but you could actually quantify that on a carbon side, because obviously you would have that on use of diesel, etc. But you're not looking to necessarily quantify by, unless you want to,
Okay, thanks, Nicola. A couple of questions just coming through in the chat. Can the implementation of this process allow you to get any kind of sustainability certificate for a completed project?
I don't know what sort of sustainability certificates are out there, but it would certainly allow you to document a process against sustainability criteria that has been published against. So to answer that question, you've got the ISO standard. The ISO standard identifies the same indicators. So the headline indicators. So you could use the sustainable management practice and say, we are working towards the ISO in line with the ISO guidance, but there's no fixed certificate as such. You can show how you're following, up-to-date guidance.
Thanks, Nicola. And would anyone using the spreadsheet have a support option? As Claire is a non-profit, the attendee is wondering how much help an organisation could get using it.
I don't think you'd actually need a lot of help, but we can always, we've got a steering group. We can always try and help. That's not a problem, but it's not a help service fixed. But we're always happy. We're always looking for, Surf UK, for example, is always looking for case studies to be published as part of the whole Surf UK forum. So if you use the SMPs and wrote it up as a case study, then yeah, we're always looking for ways of promoting good practice. So we can always help that way as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Nicola. That looks like all the questions for today. I really appreciated your time on this. It was really interesting and useful. If you're happy, we'll just unshare your screen. And I'm pleased to introduce our second speaker, Rory Devlin, who's going to be presenting on sustainable management of excavated soils on the island of Ireland. Rory has 10 years experience of brownfield redevelopment and excavated soils management, and is the waste classification technical sub-practice lead for ACOM across UK and Ireland. He is also Vice Chair of the Ireland Brownfield Network's Committee on Waste and Resource Management, which seeks to improve and standardise waste and excavated soil management resources on development sites across the island of Ireland. Thanks so much for joining us, Rory. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Ethny. Share my screen here. So yeah, as Ethny mentioned, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about sustainable management of excavated materials on the island of Ireland. So just a quick run through the agenda. So I'll do a bit of an introduction, a small bit about the Ireland Brownfield Network, touch on soil and stones and whether they should be considered as a waste or a resource, a little bit of a general overview of the legislative context, and then a summary of the waste hierarchy and various management options. I look at some of the kind of specific implementation of the legislation in both the north and the south in Ireland. And then I'll touch a small bit on what's next for the Ireland Brownfield Network and some concluding remarks. So yeah, just an introduction to myself. So as Ethny mentioned, I'm a principal environmental scientist with ACOM, and I've got 10 years experience of brownfield redevelopment and excavated soils management. And yeah, I've been doing a lot of waste classification work in this area. So hopefully I'll be able to impart some of my learnings over the last number of years to you today. So the Ireland Brownfield Network was established in 2012 by a group of environmental professionals in the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So it's people from various backgrounds, including consulting firms, regulators, contractors, and academics. We have several technical subcommittees which cover different topics like ground gas, soil reuse and waste management, early careers, and emerging contaminants. We're now at over 500 members, and we have hosted technical conferences in Dublin, Belfast, and Cork over the years. As a group, we've consulted on several industry and policy documents, including draft guidance for Articles 27 and 28 and guidance on soil recovery sites in the Republic of Ireland. And we've also drafted and issued guidance documents regarding the management of asbestos in soils and demonstrating competency in land contamination management. So our collective aim is to promote the best practice in appropriate assessment and sustainable reuse of brownfield land, and to encourage constructive dialogue and interaction with everyone that's involved in redevelopment of brownfield land on the challenges and issues that we deal with across the island of Ireland. And that includes the topic for today's talk, management of soil from development sites. It's often a fairly hot topic in terms of the development industry. And many of the issues are common to both jurisdictions, but some are unique challenges faced for regulators, operators, and practitioners in each jurisdiction on the island. And they're dealt with in kind of slightly different ways. And just to note as well that it's our 10-year anniversary, and next week we're holding a conference in Dublin for which some places are still available. So I'll do another little plug for that towards the end of the presentation. So yeah, excavated materials, so a waste or a resource. So in terms of construction and development sites, sources of excavated material basically include demolition waste, site strip for bulk excavation for basement excavations, for example, excavations for drainage and services, pilerizings, and then other excavations for foundations, pile caps, ground beams. So soil is a pretty broad term, and it can include natural soils, including rock, but also anthropogenic strata such as made ground, which is beneath or exposed at the surface. And because we're talking about sustainable management of excavated materials, we're not strictly stuck to just talking about soil. We're also talking about kind of crushed materials like brick and concrete that might be part of demolition works on a development site. I've got on screen here some construction demolition waste statistics from the Republic of Ireland. I couldn't lay my hands easily on any kind of up-to-date statistics for the North, but this should give you a kind of a general idea. So overall, C&D waste represents about a third of all waste produced in the EU. In 2018, there was 14 million tonnes of waste generated in the Republic of Ireland across all economic sectors, of which 6.2 million tonnes was C&D waste. In 2019, there was a 40% increase in the amount of C&D waste to 8.8 million tonnes. And of that 8.8 million tonnes, 7.5 million tonnes comprise soil and stone. So that's approximately 85%. And you can see that represented on the little pie chart there. The other thing in Ireland is that, and in many other jurisdictions, including the North, is that waste infrastructure capacity is steadily reducing. This is more information, a graph from the EPA and from a previous State of their Environment report. And it kind of shows the number of operational municipal waste landfills and incinerators from 2007 to 2019. And you can see there's been a huge decrease from kind of 30 odd in the late 2000s. And to the point now where in the Republic of Ireland, there's only 3 landfills that are actually accepting municipal waste as of Q1 2022. So there's a big pressure on, big pressure on waste infrastructure in terms of capacity. And that brings us back to the question of whether excavated material is a waste or a resource. And for myriad reasons, it's imperative that we move towards a more sustainable or circular economy approach of preserving resources, whether that's primary aggregates being replaced with reused excavated materials, or preventing precious landfill void space from being used up by diverting waste from landfill, prevention of carbon emissions from waste transportation, or any other ways that we can be more sustainable in terms of our approach to managing excavated materials. And both the governments in Ireland and in Northern Ireland and in Great Britain, everyone is working to produce circular economy strategies and environment strategies that are more fit for purpose in terms of the new thought process. And you can see here that the Government of Ireland, for example, in their circular economy strategy for 22-23, have noted that within the construction sector that we need greater resource efficiency and resource reuse to avoid the need for millions of tons of virgin raw materials to be produced, and also to reduce the carbon intensity of our built environment. And as a byproduct of this, reducing the volume and associated costs of construction demolition waste could also contribute greatly to affordability of development, for example, of new homes, given the current housing crisis. Similarly, the draft environment strategy for Northern Ireland that was out for consultation recently, they note that by designing things differently, we can reduce the overall demand for raw materials, reduce waste generation, and create things that retain value throughout their entire life cycle. And that we can retain embodied carbon by keeping materials in circulation for longer and adopting a less linear kind of produce, use, dispose economy and moving to a more circular model. But in order to sustainably reuse material, it needs to be fit for purpose and demonstrated to be fit for purpose as well. So the overall legislative framework and context, the Waste Framework Directive from 2008 is basically, it sets the overall context, and it defines waste as any subject or object which the holder discards or intends or is required to discard. So if any material is excavated on site doesn't meet this definition, then there is a potential for beneficial reuse. And assessment of environmental suitability for the most part takes place under the contaminated land assessment regime, although there are other factors that need to be assessed. So it's important to note that waste remains a waste until it's been fully recovered. This is the case even when the holder of the waste changes and the subsequent user might have subsequent holder might have a use for it. And there's no single factor like the source of the material, its nature or composition can determine if something is not a waste. The Waste Framework Directive also incorporates the waste hierarchy, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but obviously prevention of waste is the top and step in the waste hierarchy, so the most important or most preferred. And then as we move down through preparing for reuse, recycling, recovery, and then disposal, it's the least preferable option. So the Waste Framework Directive, like I said, it defines what a waste is, but it also helps to define what a waste isn't. And it includes a number of exclusions. So the first one that's of interest to development sites is that land which remains in situ, including unexcavated contaminated soil, is excluded from the scope of the Waste Framework Directive, as are uncontaminated soils and other naturally occurring materials, which are excavated in the course of construction activities and which are reused on the same site from which they are excavated. There's a number of other items that are excluded from the Waste Framework Directive as well, such as wastewaters, animal byproducts. They're not of relevance here, but potentially of relevance are waste resulting from prospecting, extraction, treatment, and storage of mineral resources in the working of quarries. In addition to those exclusions, the Waste Framework Directive also includes provisions for byproduct and end of waste. So a byproduct is a substance or object resulting from a production process, the primary aim of which is not the production of that item. In terms of development sites, your byproduct will be the soil or stones that's produced as a result of the excavation for a basement or foundations, whatever. So the process is the digging out of your basement, and the byproduct is the soil and stone that arises from that excavation. Similarly, an end of waste is when waste ceases to be a waste and becomes a product or a secondary raw material. So the one you're probably most familiar with is aggregates, production of secondary aggregates from the crushing of construction and demolition waste. So in summary, so waste, like I said, is any substance or object which the holder discards or intends to or is required to discard. And that includes both disposal and recovery actions. So I'll touch on those a bit more shortly. And then not waste will be any unexcavated contaminated soil that's left in situ. I should also have included their excavated soils that can be reused on the same site they were excavated from, materials that are deemed a byproduct, and materials that have gone through the end of waste process. So the first example here is waste prevention. And this is typically done at the kind of design phase. So you design out waste by carrying out a pre-demolition or pre-commencement audit to identify what types of materials you have on site, what environmental risks or human health risks there might be, and also working out what the waste characterization of those soils would be if they needed to be excavated and disposed of. So in this example, this is real data and a real dig plan, but the scenario I'm discussing is made up just for the purpose of this example. So on this slide, we see a development site where a site investigation has been carried out. You can see numerous borehole and trial pit locations represented by the different colored dots on the map. And what the plan shows is the waste classification excavation plan, which is produced for the developer and the contractor so that they can plan and manage their excavation activities in terms of disposal of soils. The blue cells represent soils that have been classified as inert. The yellow cells are soils that are classified as non-hazardous, and the red cells are soils that are classified as hazardous in terms of disposal. And the three images from left to right show the made ground from 0 to 1 meters, 1 to 2 meters, and then 3 to 4 meters of a typo, that should be 2 to 3 meters. But what having this information early in the process allows you to do is to design out, if possible, the potential need to excavate hazardous material and help prevent generating waste. So in this example, if we consider what might be the best location to install an attenuation tank, which needs to be dug to 3 meters or 4 meters or whatever depth it needs to go to. And by examining the existing data we have, we can identify a location here in which the soil at all depths is non-hazardous. And that means that you prevent the generation of hazardous waste, which is important because as well as being more expensive to dispose of, there are no hazardous waste landfills on the island of Ireland for this type of contamination. And it helps to prevent the need to export this material to Great Britain or to mainland Europe, which involves obviously a lot of extra kind of carbon that's being embodied in the waste by either through both the truck movements, but also the shipping of the material from the port across to its final destination. Now, the caveat to this is that if we've decided that the rest of the site is to be left in situ, then any materials that are left in situ need to be risk assessed in the context of the proposed land use, and also in terms of the construction activities. So the contractor's risk assessment method statement will need to take account of the contamination that's left in situ. But provided that risk assessment shows that contamination in other parts of the site is sufficiently low risk or sufficiently or can be sufficiently mitigated, then you can proceed with the development with minimal risk. The next scenario then is reuse of excavated materials, so reuse on the site of excavation. So as I mentioned previously, I've put up a little snip of the exclusion from the scope of the Waste Framework Directive, which says that uncontaminated soil and naturally occurring materials excavated in the course of construction activities can be reused on the same site from which they were excavated. So in that way, they never become a waste. So this is managed through the contaminated land regime. And it's important to note that neither the Waste Framework Directive or Northern Irish or Republic of Ireland legislation or guidance define the terms contaminated or uncontaminated. So it's a little bit of a grey area and somewhat open to interpretation. The European Commission has produced guidance which states that uncontaminated soil is essentially relates to virgin soil or soil that is equivalent to virgin soil. But in the UK, the Clare development industry definition of waste code of practice, it takes a kind of more broad approach and says that soil may be considered, or soil that may not be considered contaminated for a given land use may, for a different and more sensitive land use, even on the same site, be considered contaminated. So it basically comes down to assessing risks to human health and controlled waters from the material in the context of the proposed reuse. And that's important to consider and to take account of. The other means of reusing excavated materials then are as a byproduct or an end of waste. And these are subject to meeting the conditions which are shown on screen here. So these are the conditions that are provided in the Waste Framework Directive. And while they're slightly different, they're kind of broadly the same, basically. So in both cases, you need to show that the further use is lawful, that the substance that you're proposing to reuse meets the relevant product, environmental and health protection requirements for its specific use, and that it won't lead to adverse environmental or human health impacts. And the other criteria are basically around certainty of use, that that you have a defined end use for the material, and that you're not just reusing it in some like creation of a berm or some landscaping or something like this, which isn't part of the design of the site, and which would effectively be landfilling. So what it's trying to ensure is that there's a specific and genuine beneficial reuse for the material, and that it's not just being used to avoid paying landfill charges to dispose of the material. The final options then, and again these are the lowest in the waste hierarchy, are recovery and disposal of excavated materials. So recovery and disposal are both waste activities which occur at licensed or permitted sites, but which differ in the types of waste they can accept and the way that the waste is dealt with. Waste classification, so I'm not going to go into it in detail, but suffice to say that all waste for recovery or disposal have to be appropriately characterized, including waste classification to determine if they're hazardous or non-hazardous, and then if necessary, assessment against relevant waste acceptance criteria appropriate to the proposed facility. Recovery facilities are often worked out quarries which are being restored by backfilling, or sites where soil and stone is imported to raise natural ground levels. So they don't tend to have kind of environmental controls, so they tend to be only able to accept relatively clean and benign materials. Whereas disposal facilities are generally engineered landfills which have appropriate engineering controls to protect underlying soil and groundwater from contamination. And the level of control will depend on the type of waste for disposal. So obviously a landfill for inert soils is going to need a lot less protective measures than a landfill that was going to accept hazardous waste. So as I mentioned, but I'll reiterate again, waste for disposal it's the least favorable option, and but sometimes it's necessary, again, if you don't have a genuine beneficial reuse for material, then it becomes a waste because you have a requirement or a need to discard of the material. And in that case, waste classification, management and disposal needs to be carried out in line with the kind of duty of care requirements. And it has to be disposed of suitably and to somewhere that's geotechnically and geochemically suitable. For waste soils to be managed properly, they must be assessed based on specific data, so site-specific investigation and geochemical analysis. And then the comparison of the results needs to be done, like I said, in accordance with the appropriate and relevant guidance and legislation. So then, in terms of the Irish context, the basic principles I've gone through in the previous slide are the same across Ireland and Great Britain, and both jurisdictions in Ireland, but they're adopted and regulated differently in each jurisdiction. It's got a little better in the south over the last number of years in terms of becoming a bit more structured. So waste prevention is typically done at the design and planning stage, like I mentioned, through contaminated land risk assessment regime. And typically there's little to no regulatory input in this stage. It's kind of done by the client and their consultants to try and find, what's the best design and most economic design, most sustainable design, and management options in terms of the proposed development and what fits. In terms of on-site reuse, again done through contaminated land risk assessment. This is generally achieved through planning, so often via a methodology for beneficial reuse of on-site reuse of material, which is detailed in a construction environmental management plan. And development of a KEMP is typically a planning condition, but it won't always consider beneficial reuse unless unless that's part of the proposed development. And the EPA did bring out new guidance on preparation of a resource waste management plan as part of a KEMP. They brought out this guidance kind of late last year, December last year, which does reinforce the message that people should be considering this and moving towards a more kind of sustainable circular economy approach. I would note that it is different on EPA licensed sites where interaction and liaison with the relevant EPA enforcement and licensing inspectors will be required for any kind of on-site beneficial reuse. Off-site reuse is done by the byproduct method, which I mentioned earlier. In the Republic of Ireland, this is known as an Article 27 notification, which is made to the EPA. So only, as I mentioned earlier, only a production residue can be considered a potential byproduct, and the initial assessment of whether a production residue is a byproduct or a waste is conducted by the economic operator. So either the client or someone kind of delegated on their behalf, like their contractor, to make an assessment and notification. So the notification is submitted to the EPA, and they have guidance which they brought out. There's specific guidance on soil and stone byproducts, which is published in 2019, but there are byproduct doesn't just relate to soil and stone, so there is also guidance on byproduct notifications for other materials as well. But the guidelines, the guidance gives good information on the kind of level of rigor that needs to be included, and to demonstrate that the material can have a further use and doesn't need to be defined as a waste, and that it can be used without causing overall adverse impacts to the environment or to human health. So the economic operator notifies the EPA that they have made a decision that the material is a byproduct, and then the EPA have given themselves a 10-week period in which to either make a determination that they agree or disagree with the notification of the material as a byproduct, or else to go back and ask for more information if they don't feel that enough supporting data has been provided. The EPA maintains a register of Article 27 notifications on its website, and they also report statistics. Didn't quite get a chance to grab them, but there's definitely, over the last number of years, with the publication of this guidance and the kind of increasing appetite, I suppose, for reuse of soils and circular economy approaches, that there's definitely a growing volume of and tonnage of material that's being notified to the EPA and beneficially reused under Article 27 byproduct notification. In terms of end of waste, there's a couple of different levels of end of waste. There are 3 or 4 end of waste decisions that have been made on an EU-wide basis. So one is for scrap iron, if I recall correctly, and another one for glass cullet. So these are kind of EU-wide decisions which set out the relevant standards that the material needs to meet in order to be recycled and brought back into use as a product through the end of waste mechanism. Beyond that, there are national and then site-specific or scenario-specific end of waste decisions which can be granted. The EPA haven't yet granted any national ones, but there is a push by the kind of development and construction industry to get a national end of waste decision for crushed concrete. But while that hasn't been achieved yet, there are a number of individual kind of specific scenarios which have been granted end of waste decisions for crushed concrete. So there's draft end of waste guidance is published on the EPA website that deals with how to make an end of waste application and the requirements. And yeah, it's basically about fulfilling the 4 criteria that I mentioned earlier, in terms of having a specific use for it and showing that it's environmentally suitable for reuse. In terms of recovery and disposal then, the EPA brought out 2020 guidance on waste acceptance criteria at authorized soil recovery facilities. which provides a framework for development of waste acceptance criteria for soil recovery facilities. It's based on soil geochemical data, which the GSI worked on. So GSI developed seven different geochemical domains based on the kind of background soil chemistry. And the idea again is to make sure that soil that's taken from one particular site in one part of the country and moved to a site in another part of the country isn't going to represent a risk to, for example, groundwater or surface water, owing to the concentrations of metals that are that could even potentially be naturally present in the soils at the source site. So in addition to looking at metals, it looks at a number of other parameters like organics, such as hydrocarbons, and asbestos, total organic carbon, and a few other criteria. But it has given a kind of a standard framework for assessment of material that's going to permitted and licensed soil recovery facilities, which, as discussed previously, need a kind of tighter regime, and it needs to be cleaner soil than what's going to an engineered landfill. And in terms of soil that is going to engineered landfills for disposal, classification needs to be carried out in accordance with EPA guidance on waste classification, and the soil needs to be also tested for waste acceptance criteria and to ensure that it meets the relevant facilities acceptance criteria. In terms of Northern Ireland then, it's a different and slightly less structured situation. So waste prevention is again dealt with at the design and planning stage under the contaminated land assessment regime, so similar to Ireland and Great Britain. And waste disposal is also similarly undertaken in accordance with the Northern Irish version of the Environment Agency's WM3 guidance on classification and assessment of waste, and through assessment of waste acceptance criteria. But apart from that, other management options are dealt with through a mixture of declarations, exemptions, and regulatory position statements from the NIEA. And it can be a little bit vague at times. So there's a number of these different declarations, exemptions, and RPS, such as land treatment for agricultural benefit or ecological improvement, guidance on reuse of greenfield excavated materials in construction, testing regimes for receiving soils and wastes under exemption. So any excavated material that's not under a greenfield declaration, leaving the red line planning boundary of site, is considered to be a waste, with a few limited exemptions. So paragraph 11 for reclamation and remediation, paragraph 19 for construction and maintenance. And it must be dealt with under duty of care and all the obligations to go along with that, including registered waste carrier, appropriate consignment notes, transfer notes, etc. Exemptions also tend to be quite limited and restricted, for example, in the overall tonnage of soil that can be managed. And yeah, there's no kind of clear framework or structure the same way that they developed in the South now in terms of byproduct and for beneficial reuse of soils. In practice, what tends to happen is that although the Clare DOCOP, the definition of waste code of practice for the development industry, has not been formally adopted in Northern Ireland, and there are no plans to adopt it, on-site and off-site reuse tends to be achieved through the production of a material management plan, which adopts the DOCOP principles. And effectively, the DOCOP principles are the byproduct requirements, which I outlined earlier, in relating to certainty of use and not causing environmental harm. Yeah, so the materials management plan will be typically submitted to the planning authority, and you get kind of approval that way. And in some cases, planning authorities can actually put in conditions relating to the requirement to prepare a material management plan. It just kind of depends on a case-by-case basis. So yeah, just to conclude, the future presents opportunities to see material and waste differently and to move towards a more circular approach to economy, to better protect our natural resources, and to keep materials in circulation and in use, and just provide a more circular approach to development. Potentially better self-regulation or better regulator-driven regulation would be of benefit, particularly in the north, where it's a little bit disjointed in terms of the gap between on-site reuse of material and disposal as waste. And there will also potentially be increasing divergence in the form of things that flow from Brexit and the UK's or the Great Britain's divergence from the EU regulatory sphere. At the moment, the reason Northern Ireland has an NI specific version of the WM3 guidance is that they still fall within the kind of requirement to adhere to the EU rules, whereas the GB version has differed slightly. There's been a number of technical adaptations and technical updates to the CLP, the classification, labeling and packaging regulations, which kind of underpin the waste classification, which have occurred since Brexit. And so those have been adopted by the EU, but have not yet been adopted by Britain, although they haven't necessarily been ruled out. They're just going to do their own assessment and decide whether they want to update the same technical differences or not. And in terms of risks, poor industry practice or continued poor industry practice is certainly a constant risk in terms of management of excavated materials. And the other big ticket item that's going to be of increasing concern over the years is emerging contaminants such as PFAS, PER, and polyfluoroalkylated substances. So you've probably seen these in the news that they're kind of ubiquitous across the world. There isn't much guidance or legislation on them in the UK or Ireland at present, but different areas, different constituencies across Europe have introduced limits on the concentrations of PFAS that are allowable in soils that can be beneficially reused. And in light of the very, very low concentration limits or that are allowed for in legislation for protection of groundwater, the limits for PFAS in soils for recovery and beneficial reuse are also set extremely low. So it's certainly a potentially large stumbling block to the sustainable management of excavated materials in the future. And just to wrap up in terms of what the IBN are doing, the IBN have actually started working on a framework of kind of signposting documents for sustainable management of excavated soils during construction, and the aim of which is to provide a kind of more industry standard approach and to try and better align the approach in the north and south and get a more common kind of approach to management of excavated materials. The IBN is proposing to do this thematically, so to reflect the prioritization set out in the waste hierarchy, and including circular economy principles. So we've sent out a kind of consultation document and questionnaire to a number of potential stakeholders, and we're looking forward to kind of getting people involved from both regulation and industry consultancy, and yeah, working on trying to provide a better and more coherent approach to excavated soils management. So yeah, that's our next steps, is to collaborate with the identified stakeholders, and then our goals eventually is a production in consultation with these stakeholders of non-technical leaflets or booklets by subject, so prevention, reuse, recycling, etc., which will be of benefit to contractors, developers, regulators, even whoever's involved in kind of making decisions on the fate of excavated materials. And yeah, if you want to get involved in the IBN, you can register at irelandbrownfieldnetwork.com/join us. You know, we're always welcoming of more volunteers and more people getting involved, and the more people we have involved in it, the more kind of knowledge we can bring in from across the industry, and it'll just help to improve the IBN and hopefully improve brownfield redevelopment on the island of Ireland. And finally, as I mentioned, just first of all, thank you to the IES and to REMSOC for the opportunity to speak to you today. And also a little plug for our 10-year anniversary event, which is happening next Thursday, the 15th September, in the Royal Society of Antiquaries building on Merrion Square in Dublin. So it's a full day conference with a very interesting lineup of speakers who are talking across three broad themes, of circular economy and this kind of excavated soils management that I've been speaking to today. And then also ground gas and then emerging contaminants or emerging concerns. So both PFAS and also climate change impacts on sustainable management of excavated materials. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. So if you have any queries or questions, please do share.
Perfect. So we've got a few questions that have come through on the chat, Rory, so I'll kick off with those. One from Andy. You noted a long-term decline in landfill capacity across Ireland. Over this time, have you noticed an increase in the number of developments that are using on-site soil washing of contaminated soils and mobile concrete crushing apparatus for reuse on site? Similarly, have you noticed an increase in the use of burrow pits across developments infilled with unwanted soils?
There doesn't tend to be a lot of kind of soil washing done on sites because you'd need an environmental permit to do that. So developers and contractors tend not to want the kind of headache or the lead-in time required to do that unless it's a particular kind of problem that's known in advance, and you know that the whole kind of development is sort of founded upon the idea that this would take place. Concrete crushing is a regular activity. I mean, that happens kind of every day of the week, and that is done under a kind of typically in the south anyway, in Dublin or the rest of the Republic of Ireland, that would typically be done under using a mobile crusher, which is operating under a waste permit. And this actually creates a little bit of an issue in terms of the material that's produced, because the local authorities tend to see it as, because it's done under a waste permit, that the output is a waste. And so it can't be used as a byproduct. And in order to reuse that material permanently, you would need to go through the end of waste regime, and that's why they're working on a kind of national end of waste application for crushed concrete at the moment, because I mean, like for years concrete was crushed and reused as, you know, aggregate under paths and roadways and stuff on site, and a lot of it has actually also been previously used under Article 27 as byproduct. But again, strictly speaking, that probably isn't appropriate. So the only sites that have kind of achieved an Article 28 for concrete are sites where they tend to be landfills where they can take in the concrete and kind of sort it, and then they set up a crushing and grading plant, and they can produce it to the kind of quality standards that are required to demonstrate that it meets the product standard. That's been kind of the hold up for doing it on site, in that it's difficult using a mobile crusher on a kind of development site where space is restricted to kind of achieve the necessary grading and that to give you the equivalent quality product standard of the virgin aggregate that the secondary aggregate would be replacing. So the second part of the question then, I suppose, was increasing the use of borrow pits across developments infilled with unwanted soils. I mean, there's, again, like if you have a cut and fill balance where you need to excavate in certain areas and fill in other areas of site, you know, that's allowable under the kind of existing framework, as long as there's a kind of contaminated land assessment of risks to human health and environment, which demonstrate that there's no issue with doing so. And the other part of it is that the soils have to be kind of geotechnically suitable for the purpose. So that's a fairly standard kind of industry process. So yeah, that does go on.
Thanks for that, Rory. A couple more coming through. From your experience, how good is client or developer buy-in in terms of accepting the waste hierarchy and investing more money at early project stages in order to better manage waste throughout the development lifespan?
Varies. Yeah, I mean, kind of larger developers, and particularly like in Ireland now, a lot of the developers are kind of large American multinationals, and they would be quite proactive in terms of investing at an early stage, like doing a comprehensive site investigation and getting the information that they require to kind of plan everything out. And this approach is changing across industry as well. It's getting more common. Like there's less and less days where you're kind of turning up to site and being asked to tell people if the soil in the truck going out the door is okay to go or not. So it's improving, and the kind of sustainability certifications like LEED and BREEAM are part of that as well, because they include kind of sustainability points for you know, making use of brownfield and resources, the infill developments, and demonstrating that kind of sustainable remediation has taken place in that. So the kind of overall improvement in knowledge and awareness of these things over the last number of years has kind of helped improve the quality of site investigations. But again, it's a balance, and it's something that we're always trying to stress and impress upon developers, that they'll probably save money in the long run if they invest a bit more at the start. But yeah, it's always a balance that, you know, particularly if they're not sure if they're going to develop a site or just going to flip it on, they're not willing to invest a huge amount in a kind of comprehensive site investigation if they think they might just you know, sell it on and walk away from it.
Thanks, Rory. And finally, do you think landfill taxes for non-hazardous waste are still too cheap to discourage dig and dump scenarios in Northern Ireland? For example, most domestic oil spills seem to be remediated this way, with quite a volume ending up in the landfill.
Potentially, but I suppose domestic oil spills are a tricky one in that like in situ remediation works to a degree, but for example, the odor thresholds and the kind of nuisance threshold is very low. So often it is just a case that you need to dig out the worst of it, and then the kind of in situ bioremediation or whatever is used, chemical oxidation, is more of a polishing step to deal with any sort of residual contamination. It's difficult to kind of over the sort of short period of time that's required to clean up someone's home and get them, you know, back living in it, to kind of go down a full sort of remediation route. Like there is probably value in looking at all those kind of options and tools and mechanisms to help promote more sustainable reuse, and certainly, like in the same way that carbon tax is used as a tool to kind of promote you know, reducing emissions, like increasing the cost of disposal of material to landfill is obviously one tool that's potentially at the disposal of regulators and government to try and motivate people to kind of clean things up rather than just doing a dig and dump.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Rory, for that presentation and for answering those questions. That was really, really interesting. Thank you.